This is so awesome. Take a minute to look around and just see the community here, the scholars, the energy. This is great. Welcome back from break, and it is my pleasure to introduce my fantastic colleague, Gabriel Rosenberg.
What an honor and what a challenge it is to introduce Lauren Berlant. The task, I'm going to admit, is a bit daunting and has been a source of some anxiety over the past few weeks. Lauren Berlant is quite simply one of the most important and influential cultural critics of the past 3 decades, with works that are foundational to the contemporary study of literature and culture, affect, intimacy, sexuality, and politics, to just name a few. And I sometimes worry when I give introductions that I'm going to neglect to mention an important article that someone has authored, particularly if they have a lot of articles. And in this case, I worry that I will lose track of a few of Lauren's books. So I'll start there. Try not to lose track. Lauren is the George M. Pullman Distinguished Service Professor of English at the University of Chicago, and she has authored, co-authored, or edited roughly a dozen books. Her National Sentimentality trilogy runs from the 1991 publication of The Anatomy of National Fantasy through the 1997 publication of The Queen of America Goes to Washington City, and concluding with The Female Complaint in 2008. In 2011, she published Cruel Optimism, which I would class as a thematic and intellectual extension of that trilogy. And across these works, Berlant exhumes American nationalism not as a set of claims that can be contested, but as a cluster of attachments, desires, and identifications that are inhabited. We are American not insofar as we believe in a particular doctrine, but insofar as our daily lives are enmeshed and defined by a dense grid of affective structures. And these affective structures overdetermine our hopes, dreams, ambitions, achings, longings, wants, joys, and even sour disappointments. I linger on this point about feeling beyond belief because Berlant is suggesting that those of us, and I include myself in this, who would never be so naive as to believe in the doctrinal content of American greatness, that is, those of us who can recite in litany a set of provable facts and propositions about the failures of America, we nevertheless find ourselves yoked to the same ox cart as everybody else by our desires. And desire can be such a nasty thing, immune as it is to our most careful and extensively footnoted refutations, our insistence that the process of breaking bad attachments and crafting good attachments is just a simple intellectual exercise to which we merely need to direct our ample wills and intellects. And yet, as Berlant reminds us, our overweening investment in and attachment to the puissance of our will and intellect, those are actually the yoke themselves, the affective circuit that leads us to double down on the sovereign subject as an escape hatch from our collective political and ecological nightmare. The point here is that what might sustain us is not a redoubling of our will, but generating new attachments and new desires. But what alchemy is needed for such a task of such political significance? I'll return to that thought in one moment. Alongside those 4 books, Lauren Berlant has authored dozens of essays that span and bend academic genres in extraordinarily productive ways. She authored an extended essay to accompany the photography of Laura Latinsky's photography in the beautiful volume Venus Inferred. She edited and contributed to the groundbreaking intimacy issue of Critical Inquiry that was later expanded and published in an edited volume. With Lisa Dugan, she published the edited volume Harmonica Ourselves. With Lee Edelman, she co-wrote Sex or the Unbearable. And now with Kathleen Stewart, she has given us The Hundreds, a work that I will describe as guerrilla ethnography spliced with experimental poetry, and that doesn't do justice to it. It's beautiful, and you should read it immediately. I literally cannot summarize all of Berlant's contributions in a reasonable amount of time, and I am trying to keep this introduction to a reasonable amount of time. So I'll make but one more substantive point that emerges from this compilation, a point about Berlant's contributions that I think is both significant and perhaps underappreciated. I've just mentioned here several of the texts that Berlant has co-authored, but I would add to these essays texts that Berlant co-authored with Beth Friedman, Michael Warner, and Sian Nye. As prolific as Berlant has been as an author of monographs, she's also experimented with the authorial self in ways that I personally find inspiring. I don't think it's coincidental that several of these essays, particularly her essays with Friedman and Warner, have been foundational to the queer theoretic tradition. Indeed, Berlant's essay with Warner, Sex in Public, is one I teach regularly precisely because it articulates in both form and content some promising, if tentative, answers to the question about alchemy I mentioned before. And that question is, where can our desires lead us other than towards a sovereign subject of national fantasy? In that Sex in Public essay, Berlant and Warner explore the transformative possibilities of sexual counterpublics. They set before us the radical task of constructing affective structures that sustain other ways of being, other desires and longings, and produce other pleasures than those that are certified by our collective national fantasy. That's the argument. The form plays with the authorial model, and through collaboration, Berlant consistently shows that writing is also a way to experiment with being. And that leads me, I think, to the ultimate point about it, which I will confess is personal. It may not match your own experiences, people being, as the first axiom goes, different from each other. We sometimes hear the tired claim that Berlant's writing is dense. Dense? I think her writing is dense only in the way that a forest is dense in comparison to a cornfield. It's dense with difference, rippling with it, with life and with abundance. In fact, with most other texts I read, the sensation is like listening to a monologue. If it's good, I keep pace and admire the twists and turns of the argument. If it's boring, I check out and check in, cutting corners and sprinting ahead. It's a track. With Berlant, it never works that way. I find myself magnetized by each sentence. And rather than following a monologue, each sentence makes me halt and think. When I return to the text, and this is what's really unusual, I find that the next sentence responds to my thoughts, often in provocative and unexpected ways. Reading Berlant is not at all like listening to a speech. Reading Berlant is like talking to Berlant. It's the experience of a dialogue. This, to me, is the writerly DNA of Berlant, perhaps what makes her such a powerful authorial collaborator, without a doubt what makes her prose style unmistakable, indelible, without peer, shall we say, singularly dialogic. Because her writing is dialogic, it is also abundant. It is abundant like a feast is abundant, because it is a table fully set. And like a feast, Lauren's writing sustains me.
Oh, shucks. Oh, you're so amazing. Also, dense means stupid. I'd just like to point that out. and and also, while I'm at it, while I'm at it, what? And I've just been so neurotic about this talk. As Julie Winmore, who I'm very grateful to, will tell you, I brought 3 papers because I just wasn't really sure what we needed. And I don't know you well enough yet to know what you need. Like, I wish I were talking tomorrow and I have some better sense of the conversation we were building up, because then I could make a shift or something. But I don't know you well enough, so I'm going to read you what I wanted, which I'm really sorry about. But it's all I could do, you know. But I wrote this to have a conversation with you, okay? Like, I wrote this because I need to have a conversation with somebody. And you're a body, you know. And this paper's, and so anyway. I also want to say I thought Riley was amazing. And I might not be that good. You know, that was a lot of stamina up there. And also, our papers are kind of the opposite, which is good. This is a Chicago thing we're doing now, where like I usually give papers through examples. Then if you don't know the examples, you feel like you can't really ask a question. That's kind of terrible. But Riley's really good at what he does, so that wasn't a problem. But so here, but you know, I'm not as good a writer. But I work on it all the time. What did you say? Oh, yes, stand-up comedy is like, maybe I'll never get to the paper. But actually, what's really, really interesting about this, so this is a 79-page chapter. What's really interesting about this is I'm going to give you I'm going to give you three introductions, and I might not get to my examples. But I'll tell you what they were going to be, so if you want to ask about them, then you could. Okay, and the other thing is, see my email address up there? So we just had an amazing question and answer session where people I thought asked better questions than the ones I was thinking of. And if you're a shy person and don't like to talk in front of other humans, you could write me. And because I take my work on the road to make it better. So then you would be doing me a favor. If you think of something later, because you know people do, then I wish you would write me, and as an act of generosity toward the possibility of my work being less bad. That would be really great. But hopefully, well, since we have these enormous Q&A times, you'll feel welcomed. Even if I say, I don't know, could anybody else do that? Because I'm not good enough at this yet. Okay. This talk is called Sex in the Event of Happiness. Yeah. So the thing about not examples, I just want to say, so, when I ask people, after a talk, everybody says that was a really nice talk, and then they're lying because they're going to tell their friends what they really think. So I also want to say that the question I always come back with is, what's useful? What's useless? Can you think of other examples? Can you help this? Can you try to enrich the world of this exemplification? Because even if I'm stuck with the examples I'm stuck with, because no example is adequate to the questions that it's bearing. Goes without saying, but it never goes without saying because people are like, really? Because that's only one example. And you're like, yeah, I know. And like, well, what can you do? You can't say every example. Anyway, whatever. You have to be generous to yourself in the sense of that you're just limited in trying to do something. Anyway, this paper is called Sex in the Event of Happiness. The long version of it talks about sex, talks a lot about event theory, which I'm not going to say a lot about today except implicitly. So we could talk about event. What is an event? What have people said it was, and what is it? And happiness. In the last talk, there was finally a question about freedom, and I was like, really, that's about time. And so you might ask me what happiness is, but I'm not going to tell you either. So, but I actually think it's important to try to figure some things out. Okay, and this is dedicated to Jose Munoz. Introduction number 2, you'll see, begins with a little story about Jose. All right, I'm going to start now, but I'm going to keep starting because there are 3 introductions. So, all right. This talk comes from my next book called On the Inconvenience of Other People. People kind of think that the subtitle should be, but not you, but it is you, so. The book has many moving parts, and the number of introductory frames to follow has something to do with wanting to focus on discussing with you some questions about sexual misery, sexual happiness, and the problem of processing events. One ambition of the book is to do a thought experiment, and I actually think the thought experiment is a genre that Riley was also in the previous thing. A thought experiment can be a game in which people smuggle in potentially unpopular ideas under the ruse of free speech. We mainly associate that version with the irritating devil's advocate who seeks to be protected by a deniability cloak. But of course, floating ideas and following them out is central to all brainstorming. That is, the performative genre of the thought experiment can also be an attempt to knock on the coconut that fell to the ground to see if it can nourish a project that feels stuck somewhere. It is a genre of the case. One thought experiment of this book is this. 20th and 21st century social theory has largely derived its urgency and its cases from the extremes of threat and the catastrophes of geopolitical trauma. There are good reasons for that, which have to do with foregrounding the structural violences through which extreme life seeps into ordinary life, over time and at every scale, although not always in the same ways or through the same mediations. The Inconvenience Project focuses, though, not on the extremes of threat, the things that shatter life worlds, but on the difficulty of bearing what we're attached to. We know why threatening things threaten us, but it's harder to know why it's difficult to bear the things that we want. We know why threatening things are resisted so as not to be defeating, but it is harder to know why the things we look to for happiness also often induce defenses against what we want from them, especially if one thing we want is to sustain life well while we are working out what to do with it. We know that narcissists, populists, sociopaths, and capitalist supremacists threaten the pleasure and fact of our world's continuity. It's harder to understand what to do when our positive attachments produce queasy-making royals. It is not enough to say that in any attachment we fear loss. We dread having, too. These are propositions, not facts. In fact, I think all theory is propositional, but certainly these are propositions. That's what makes it a thought experiment. I want to know if there's something to learn, not only from violence that feels like violence, but from the ambivalences of attachment to life and sociality that we seek, from love to coexistence and political movements. I also want to inquire into what kinds of unlearning are involved to hold our desired or preferred adjacent objects differently and also more satisfyingly. I want to know how to loosen the impasses of the ordinary that slide from the irritating to the unbearable. In Sex or the Unbearable, Lee Edelman and I never got around to defining the unbearable, which I think is hilarious, like we knew what it was. We just pointed to it as a limit case concept and took on very different attitudes toward what to do with its intractability. In Inconvenience, the unbearable points to a pressure we feel from a system at its limit, a structure, mind, or world being tested until it appears to bend to the point of giving out. That's the paradox. To call a thing unbearable to call a thing unbearable is to admit that it must be born. I'm trying in this talk to keep the contemporary feminist engagement with the mess of sex elsewhere to the category of the unbearable. There is a lot of unbearable sex, though. I'm not saying that there isn't. The recent sex climate data at Duke provides a fresh example of the crisis ordinary of sexuality that Title IX and Me Too are also gratifyingly releasing from back channels into juridical and socially mediated publics. But if cruel optimism is about being stuck in a situation that resists being abandoned because it appears to hold together the world, and if Sex or the Unbearable, we query the pressure put on sex to solve the very problems of managing difference that it creates. In this book, I am asking how to lose what's poisonous in the object scene without denying the drive to attach, to be chosen, to matter, and to have a world one looks forward to waking up to or having a life in. In this book, I call it the inconvenience drive. So the first ambition was to ask why it's hard to bear what we want, or what we want to want, and what we can learn from thinking about that. I can say more about that later if you want, or want to want. All right. But the second ambition then is to think about the inconvenience drive, the drive to be inconvenienced by other people while moving through the world, and at the same time, not wanting to be overwhelmed by them. It is about defenses and the utility of defenses for protecting happiness. It is about consenting to proximity, but not to everything that can come with it, which to me is the main problem of thinking clearly about all consent. And it is about how people conceptualize and practice a staying with that also allows for a disturbance of, a transformation of, but also a part maintenance of relationality. It's about learning why it's hard to maintain social movements and attachment love too. It's about the stresses of ordinary life that come from wanting to maintain, but not to be fated to some of the entanglements, enmeshments, and forms of continuity. I take these terms from Moten, Povinelli, and Foucault, entanglements from Moten, enmeshments from Povinelli, for whom figuring the relation of structural violence to the forms of life we can keep making together has provided an experimental focus and commitment. The middle of the book involves 3 thought experiments about the difficulty of bearing the objects and life we want. It looks to 3 cases in which people or figures of people, including social movements, manifest both desire and aversion to the scenes to which they are attached. Chapter 1, sex. Chapter 2, democracy. In chapter 3, what I take to be the fundamental political emotion, being in life without wanting the world. This latter chapter, being in life without wanting the world, is about affirmative dissociation in the face of biopolitical attrition and the saturation of life at the bottom of social hierarchies. It's about the persistence of suicidation as a form of life that mainly affirms subordinated people's attachment to life, while marking what individuals can't change just by deciding to, because worlding requires time and multitudes to meet and hold up an atmosphere together until it becomes a form of life, and after that too. This chapter about life flourishing in proximity to flat-out immiseration would have been at home in this conference. But I didn't want to give it as a talk here, because it's not about feminism exactly, even though what I am addressing today, erotophobia, the fear and threat of sex, is one of the vicious motors of the hatred that accompanies the making and negation of biopolitical life. Erotophobia is not just the hatred and fear of sex, after all. It is projected onto anybody said to bear a kind of body deemed at once incompetent to life and too powerful in its appetites to control. Erotophobia provides the viscerality of xenophobic and domestic racism, homophobia, misogyny, empire, and bourgeois class disgust, for example. Yet some contemporary feminisms and some queer thought are also going through a phase that valorizes erotophobia as the ground zero of realism about sex and power, even though erotophobia fuels the affective naturalization of supremacist social hierarchy beyond the heteronormative projection. I will return to this problem throughout, and I hope we can have a conversation about it. The third ambition of The Inconvenience of Other People is about what critical theory and art can do. I mean, why bother writing? That's basically what I say to myself like every day. Well, you must too, right? Why bother writing or making work that butts its head against the wall of the seemingly intractable and abstract solidity of what's structural? Inconvenience exhorts critics to propose transformational infrastructures whose purpose is not just to reach a better end state or norm, but that might help us unlearn the forms of life that have sustained our trust in the ongoingness of the ordinary, and to expose ourselves to the less charted territory we have no confidence about living in, but that feels prefiguratively freer than the one we had formerly and formally trusted. It proposes that we provide figures and propositional means for bearing the long middle of change, and not the plains of transcendental consistency or revolutionary breaks that promise new beginnings. I derive this perspective on unlearning from 3 decades of decolonial thought, for which the names Walter Mignolo, Gayatri Spivak, J.K. Gibson Graham, and Jody Bird will stand here, but with them is so much detailed on-the-ground work on the transitional infrastructure and its atmospheres. The book proposes then that rather than losing our objects, we focus on loosening them, rather than replacing them with better ones. The thought experiments of this book try out some tactics for loosening the apparently intractable object scene of attachment to life. Loosening the object is a big keyword phrase for the method of inconvenience, its imminent approach to unlearning, to opening up what the Speculate This collective calls affirmative speculation about what can happen to a social formation apart from its reproduction. This project is an anti-reproductive analytic that pays attention to transforming the means of attachment. That was introduction number 1. Number 2. This talk was dedicated to Jose Munoz, who kind of hated it when he heard it. And the way he said it was, "It's not my favorite of your papers," which made me love him more, even more. But who liked it more when he read it and pushed me to intensify my fidelity to its initial questions, which were, 1, to ask how the cleavage of revolutionary love from political radicalism since the 60s has impaired both ambitions by protecting the bourgeois fantasies of the public and the private and the structural and the political. And 2, to ask how the genres of desire accompanying the mutual opacity of lovers to each other and to themselves might be a resource for projects of revolutionary thought. My claim is that love and structural revolution are more than just analogous anarchic situations from which people build out infrastructures for what they want from the world and each other. Both scenes of attachment are also distinguished by people desiring to upend and reorganize life in extremis, actually seeking out an inconvenient self and life disturbance that would help or even force them to unlearn their ways of being in the world as it is. The desired transitional moment of love and structural revolution, in other words, must involve leaps into insecurity, for the rebooting of relation into a disorganized meanwhile requires loosening our anchors in the world and the confidence-sustaining habits of judgment and intuition we've developed to navigate it. And, in addition, such unlearning forces us to learn to enjoy risking inventive flailing and experiments in thought and practice that might lead to nothing or something. José's tendency was to write into the beyond of the fraught life world, where the social relations of production and identification are forever being violently, excitedly, and awkwardly navigated. The queer utopian leap out of the mess, in gesture and thought, was his very favorite method for educating hope. He made statements here at this very Duke conference about the way life is in the Brown Commons, for example, in the hope that their truth would become truer. Instead of beyonding, I fight from and for the present that is ongoing, for that people are feeling out. Sexuality, with its webs of sex and structures expressing themselves in intimate attachments, may animate projective identifications with futures, histories, and traditions, but at the same time, appetites and the pleasures insist on an experimental attachment to testing out what's possible in relation and what patterns might emerge from within the life we are living that can produce forms that sustain worlds. Christina Sharp, in The Wake, calls this kind of perspective residence time. In her work, all of the mortal histories negating the life of Black being join with what she calls the Black insistence on existing, an insistence so central to movement cultures from below that it taps into the coexistence of all the kinds of knowledge assembled in any kind of collective life. That is the reason she gives to write and to create new narrative holdings for in-process yet precedented ways of being. It would be much easier to talk about structural power by asserting that any biopolitically subordinated and induced we is the effect of a cause. But among other movements, feminism, historically viewed, has involved more than the documentation of harms and the ordinary of brokenness, not just adding resilience to post-traumatic recovery, not just being utopian, but getting into the weeds of what to do with the creative energies that become released from a life that had been bound up in surviving supremacy. Socialism, anarchism, alternative capitalisms, and now what? That is not a rhetorical question. I don't want the embrace of erotophobia to be the answer. Introduction 3. This talk's original title was Happiness, 1972 to 1998. I agree that's funny, but I'm not sure why it is. Its ambition, as I've said, was to re-examine the negative effects of separating sexual from structural revolutionary politics. The title derived from a pun about seeking your happiness and my happiness from Last Tango in Paris, 1972, and stretched to the film Happiness, Todd Solondz, 1998. Its proposed argument was originally that, reactionary as it is, tango spoke from the radical 60s insistence on using desire's disruption of its subjects and objects to co-destroy settler colonial economies, dynamics of straight heterosex, nationalism, colonialism, the patriarchal family form, knowledge itself. The film also puts into competition with each other anti-bourgeois, anti-settler colonial economies, and pop culture style revolutionary discourse, which is not anti-capitalist at all, but which produces this idea of revolution as something that can happen in commodity culture. It also puts into conversation French exceptionalism versus Algerian colonialism, inventive loves against the familialization of all desire. This genre of the 60s was about bringing down all at once the whole normative attachment and value nexus, in the hope that having a common project of creative destruction would allow people to hang with each other while hammering out a variety of new infrastructures and heuristic institutions of value and intimacy and labor. In contrast, Todd Solondz Happiness, a quarter century later, framed its moment as the catastrophe that resulted from the anti-bourgeois revolution's erotico-political promise. Now, in the now of that film, an expansive public sex culture persists, but that fears and hates sex still. Its processes remain not only aversive and destructive, but also utterly torn from any socially transformative political imaginary that has to do with the state, capital, and even too often, the family. Erotophobia, like Solondz's, is on the rise now, too. There are recent exceptions, for example, by Kim Tallbear, Susanna Passanen, Benji Kahan, and Juana Maria Gonzalez, plus some gay male theorists in the Foucauldian tradition who believe that we invent forms of life through practices that can take on the solidity of structure as they attain infrastructural status and compose discourse worlds. These are mainly inward-facing, community-building, counter-public infrastructures of intimacy. But usually in popular culture, and always in Solondz, sex is cast in darkly tragicomic performances of individual abjection and violent compulsion. Sex and sexuality, as normalized offshoots of pleasure, are not seen as a resource for social transformation, but a problem that wedges social reproduction. Having no movement public for amplifying their resonance or their effects, they are seen as ethical modalities, falsely privatized as transactions between individuals. Projects of austerity desiccate the idea of the collective, and nowhere is this clearer than the image of privatized intimacy, Solondz storyboards, radically withdrawn from public movements or public worlds. Not even a dotted line connects bad sex with bad infrastructures of value and intimacy. So long as privatization remains the context for publicness, so long as the responsibility for the damage pleasure makes potential cases into individual case studies that bracket how an economic and intimate system of structures generates knots and harms, we remain proximate to the post-60s impasse. In short, shaped by the resources for rethinking about depoliticized intimacy and its consequences for political fantasy between Last Tango in Paris and Happiness, this paper argued that a history could be told of some things that went wrong in what's been deemed the failed encounter of sex radicalism with political radicalism. Oh, I suppose I should have shown you pictures. Okay. So this is important for later, too, because they're telling jokes in this picture. And I'm going to talk about jokes. And then this is another one. And then, okay. As the revisions went on, I added Half Nelson to the mix, another film about the necessity and difficulty of keeping radical political thought open to the pedagogy of sexual politics, and vice versa. What went wrong doesn't mean everything failed in the sex politics, structural politics conjuncture. A specific political project did. In Tango, it's the happiness problem, which I take to refer both to the radical 60s attempt to conjoin anti-bourgeois class struggle with the shift in the terms of the prison of cisgender normativity and the heteronormative sexual contract, plus the problem of sustaining and remaining with an unfinished revolution when its outcomes continue genuinely to be mixed. This transition has been especially difficult because, as we are living now, when privilege unravels, it goes out kicking and screaming, and people lose confidence in how to be together, uncertain about how to read each other, and incompetent even to their own desire, wanting everything to be post already, with few skills for bearing transition, as the incels, brain cells, and many new sex-negative feminists exemplify. The transition of learning, of unlearning, and the transition of rebuilding are two foci of this talk. What follows, though, moves through a kind of darkness I hadn't anticipated when I started this paper, which can be phrased this way. How is it possible to be a sex-positive person given the pervasiveness of sexual violence in the normative membrane? How does a sex-positive thinker think with erotophobia without exceptionalizing it, exoticizing it, hastily repairing it, denying its confirming pleasures, or framing it condescendingly as other people's failure to be enlightened or adequate or cool? One ambition of this book is to return ambivalence from its association with negativity to its genuine technical state of intensively clashing aims. In the case of pleasure, the aim is at once to be open and receptive to it, and not to be overwhelmed by it in a way that breaks something, like the belief in the possibility of trust or a spirit. In the early drafts of this work on tango, it was tempting to make false equivalences between the logic released by projects of unlearning toxic institutional norms and the film's undeniably destructive sexual experiments. Maria Schneider characterized, do people know this film? Or are you too young? Oh, no, all right, I think I got that. So there's a scene where Marlon Brando improvised anal rape of the character played by Maria Schneider and makes her then chant. He not only anally rapes her, but also makes her chant an anti-bourgeois ideology. Okay, so, you know, and then in the next scene, she gives him an electric shock and makes him have to take in pop intimacy, pop version. And then in the next scene, he has her penetrate him and say the same speech that he had made her do. So it looks like at some level, but it's not true, equality, but it isn't. Oh, well. Okay, so, you know, all right. So that's a summary of this section of the paper. So in the narrative arc of the film, this takes place among many other shocks, slaps, cruelties, and anal penetrations that call for the end of repression at home and imperialism elsewhere. In the early drafts of this chapter, I seem to want to say that if we see the violence of unlearning the normativity of sex as the price we have to pay for becoming different together, then the violences can neutralize or overcome each other. Audiences got mad at me for implying that all violences were equal, all penetrations equally disruptive of the foundations of gender, heterosexuality, the church, the family, the nation, capital, and the world. They were right. And then I took to the couch for a few years and tried to figure out, you know, if I thought something else, or if I was stuck in that thought, which was a bad thought. I believe now that this talk has something to offer by interrupting the impasse between the affirmative and aggressive view of sex, one that does not minimize or negate the prospects of happiness or violence. It has something related to offer, the imaginary of revolution, that deals with social antagonism at different scales and different contexts. What follows mainly reads with and around the disturbance of sexuality, amplifying its pleasures and asking what they have to do with its rapes. I'm not really talking about tango today at all, barely anything else other than theory, but I'm highlighting the longer paper's reframing of the inconvenience of sexual disturbance by thinking about the difference between disturbance and trauma when we're in the room with sex. And then in the transformational infrastructure of the paper, thinking about the relation of sex to jokes. Why is it? Well, you'll see. Okay, so I think that's all the introductions. Now we're getting into the grain of the paper. The paper opens with consideration of the constant joking during sex talk and tango, all of it improvised. The jokes aren't very good, but the question remains, why does a film about revolutionary drives against racial, sexual, gendered, and imperial inequality spend so much time joking around? It goes on, any work on relationality would do well to consider the joke. Dependent as it is on the inferred and intimated, a joke is a most intimate bodily genre. As a performance of aggressive complicity, it seeks also to test and induce reciprocity, mutuality, and affective continuity, whether between individuals or professionals with an audience. If one is lucky and in on the joke, the reciprocity is formal, technical, a performance of a sudden interestedness and solidarity. Or a joke can provide a painful attachment break if the telling is inept or one does not get it, or worse, if the content is offensive and one is bruised by being averse to it or the butt of it, watching from the outside while others enjoy its loosely affirmative holding environment. Freud proposes that the effect of the swift, intimate sociality made by the joke is not cognitive. Instead, he insists, as the joke works by an economy of surprise and withheld explanation, it is entirely affective and social, and the pleasure of its available, rapid mutuality passes over the surface of language to create the incomparable promise of a shared, unthreatening awkwardness. Every joke calls for a public of its own, Freud writes. The eruption of humor tests the terms of what kinds of disturbance strengthen an encounter with the performance of inclusion. All genres are affective conventions that allow readers to expect to feel held, even for a moment, in a world. The aesthetic world they enter for being absorbed and enjoyed, and the world of affective and code sharing that it suggests. Freud's joke books and many books about humor that have come after it emphasize something specific, though, about the intimacy that a witty act extends, that it's a sexual form. What do they mean by that? Foucault famously writes that sexuality is noisy, that it moves from mouth to ear. This resonates with Freud's claim that joking de-represses the sexually knotted up subject, less by confessing an unbearable secret or disgusting knowledge that she has encrypted within her, than by depressurizing pleasure's appetites, often sadistically. The Bergsonian tradition sees this task executed in rapid collapses, inversions, and cuts that refuse the comfort that resting in comedic form can provide, while delivering a delight in assessing and surviving moments of ruffled confidence in oneself and others. If this is right, then comedy is always a comedy of survivance, Gerald Visenor's term for the endurance of survival and resistance, even if something is small, as being discomfited by a joke. If this is right, then the impersonality of the joke, its spontaneous takeover of consciousness, is a test of relationality itself. And this scenario points us to the happy, sadistic eruption of banter that provides so much pleasure to love plots, where there is verbal sexual experiment, joking's bursts of inclusivity, mutuality, and affective lightness points to a coexisting sexual drama whose expression of need, aggression, compulsion, and affective imbalance does not negate intimacy, but is also at its core. So the comedic and the joke get inside the logic of ambivalence. In ambivalence, we want and we don't want what we want, because being in relation and forging attachments within it threatens and relieves us from our sovereign fantasies and states. Any object of desire reminds us that we are not sovereign. So any object of desire is, in the terms of this book, inconvenient. The pleasure extracted from any relation codes non-sovereignty as an erotic threat in good and bad senses. In tango, being game for sex, for joking, and for revolution allows the possibility of new social relations between beings who can bear to identify with the ways relationality is always confusing, incoherent, and feeling out for form, despite attaching at the same time to clashing assessments and aims. Feeling out is endurable so long as the mode they find for it performs an okayness with the insecurity of what's ongoing and the difficulty of taking things in without being dominated by dramas of subordination and loss, which will also always be there. So we can learn a lot about desires for and resistances to structural social transformation from the training in strong ambivalence that co-locates the comedic and the sexual. The joke's pedagogy is erotically social in a number of senses. It is a form that induces mutual affective delight if it works, and shamed, deadened bodies if it doesn't. That induces self-forgetting and self-suffusion at the same time if it works, and the weight of being stuck with oneself if it does not. The scene of a perfect meeting of being you and not you, both delighted and untraumatized by a surprise that displaces you from your self-continuity without shattering your confidence, if it works. And a confirmation of a broken attachment circuit with the world and one's own self-idealization, if it does not. Likewise, in both cases, if things work well enough in the moment, you might not feel good about the success of the episode of joking, which after all has been technically disturbing. Good sex can induce all sorts of regret and ambivalence, just as a joke often induces a guilty conscience, if it works. I use the propositional if rather than the realist when here to foreground how open to revision being in relation is in all genres of intimate encounter. But the differences matter. A joke, when proposed, is like an I love you awaiting reciprocation, but without most of the pressure of holding up an ego or an enduring world. Still, an incident of witticism asserts a social position. It makes an appeal but disguises it as a dare, a test of perceptual expertise, and or a gift. The range of potentials allows deniability on all counts. The joke can just thus be seen, if it works, as akin to the form of good sex with another person. I have lots of masturbation jokes, which I took out. All right. But I guess I couldn't bear it. To work means to achieve its aim of circulating explicit pleasure in a sociality that induces delight, out of controlness, and a sense of a world you want to be in, even if just for a moment. It folds into the present a quality that is not meant to be stretched out over every moment of the day or throughout the ordinary, but which, by virtue of its appearance, resonates in those other temporalities and conditions of life. Even aggressive wit offers mutuality while withholding the relief it offers. Still, even given dark scenarios, few genres of social reciprocity are as reliable as the joke form is, at once delivering and denying intimacy. This is why jokes can be at once pleasureless and welcomed, like sex. As they exemplify forces in the scene of encounter, the resonance of sex in the joke and the promise and threat of the joke in sex take on extra performance pressure when we turn to what sex has come to mean in some parts of the world, and particularly the social and political pressures to make sex adequate to build a world on, to be like the joke that always works and that buries the complexities of aggression and intention amid the noise of normative, romantic, virtuous, stirring, ethical, or merely affirmative pleasure. Because of its bodily effects and structural utility, sex bears the burden of such optimism. That is its problem. Optimism is often unbearable. So is the fact of the inconvenience drive, and the openness to life, which are inevitable, but often feel forced and coerced. The optimism is for an impossible state of things, the perfect rhythm of being in and out of control, open and closed in the right or bearable way, the possibility of navigating ambivalence toward our own and the world's incoherence. This leads to the pleasure and relief that many feel in giving into a state of pure erotophobia, a fear of what's overwhelming in sex that resolves into a strong aversion or hate. Erotophobia can be a relief because it resolves ambivalence. It casts sex as trauma and blames sex for disturbing what is already disturbed, the live sensorium encountering the world, and the beings who are trying to keep things together. But the disturbance of sex, this is propositional, the disturbance of sex is different from the trauma of sex. This is the longer chapter's other proposition and thought experiment, the first one having been about the generativity of play and sex. Let's think about the ordinariness of disturbance. Insofar as we are affected by the world, by people, by language, by things, we are disorganized by them. Insofar as we take in the impact of encounters with the world, we wobble surprised, incessantly adjusting. Insofar as we are members of disrespected populations, this process is at once invigorating and exhausting too, because even proud, aggressive defenses are profoundly energy-sucking if you have to resort to them all the time. Consider the difference between being sexually assaulted by someone's control over time, space, and body, and the ordinary unclarities of the sexual event that induce going with the flow of it from some closeness or distance, and sufficiently enjoying it when a rhythm's established. Good enough sex is ordinary, which doesn't mean it's always fun or salutary. It's the affective domain of okayness. It implies that the episode doesn't achieve the status of drama, let alone of trauma, at the time. It stays around as the possible source of future repetition, pleasant or bad. It can be later reclassified, as so many things are. But most encounters, even most mixed encounters, aren't reconsidered. And that's not just from a failure of imagination or repression or a defense against confronting the ordinary of violence. When one consents to something sexual, one is consenting to a thing that's about to happen, not a thing that one holds with assurance. One is assenting to be overwhelmed or disorganized or aroused by touch in the right way, whatever one means by that. And often what one means by that, specifically in positive terms, is surprisingly variable, elastic, and imprecise. In contrast, what seems negative seems pretty clear. The point here is that we live in disturbance, in an attachment to inconvenience, cultivating heuristics and processes to lubricate moving with and within the space of being affected, even when it's bad or weird or awkward. But an event of trauma is not a disturbance. Trauma breaks the ongoingness of ordinary movement, defeating our styles of relating our openness to our defenses. This distinction can be hard to see. Often we want the satisfaction of continuums, which then nominate the worst extreme as the meaning of the innocuous-looking one. But what if the ordinary of disturbance is one thing and the break of trauma another? The insistence of the joke and its capture of time models the relation of the fractured to the broken. So too, conventional sex, like theory and politics, usually both seeks out the disturbance of excitement and promises a kind of simplifying, clarifying, or sustaining pleasure anchor if it is sex that one wants to want, or wants to be game for. Think of the clumsy physicality sex induces in the body, the voice, and the face, the confusion and resignations of knowledge, even in a scene of delight. the small and large breakdowns of concentration and confidence all throughout any episode, and the work of quieting that down so things can proceed. Think of how unreadable the lover is. That's why you have to say, how is it for you? Because you don't really know. Even when response is well amplified, e.g. you can hear it, but that doesn't mean anything. Think of the sometimes desperate, sometimes bitter, sometimes dejected, sometimes funny rage to stay in sync in the middle of all the internal and external noise, and the aggressive desire that must be mobilized not just to stay in the zone while keeping the inconvenient other in it too, while maintaining one's own openness to openness if anyone else is there. If not, one is one's own inconvenient other. Any episode in proximity to sex induces a massive cluster of soft and hard double takes, short ones and long, from neutral and anxious to panicked. Given the self-incoherence that characterizes any being, and given the lack of fit between or among any persons, even the simplest sexual pleasure involves a collaboration of tangles. And remember, I'm emphasizing here sex that's in some sense or senses desired. I feel the need to keep reminding you of this because our contemporary training in erotophobic subjectivity, which casts sex as an overwhelming object of fear and threat, tends to make us frame its pleasures as good luck and pain as the real. I'm trying to keep everything in play, to keep the situation open to its variety of outcomes and moods. Implicitly, I am arguing, too, that the incapacity to see the drama of dynamic intimacy as traveling across sex to mass sociality misses an opportunity to refine the problem of distinguishing between the perturbation of being in relation generally and the trauma of it. Queer commentary has produced two main solutions to this clash between being disturbed in sex and yet simpler in pleasure. In one direction, it has valorized zoning for sex and builds ethical and political worlds without ratifying the couple form or the ambition to be recognized in the liberal sense or known all the way through in proximity to sex. From Guy Hockingham to Shaka McLaughlin, this zoning produces concepts of contact and reciprocity that allow sex and sexuality to build worlds without reproducing property relations, while continuing to reproduce other objecting hierarchies related to class, race, and beauty. But other anti-social accounts of sex, written from the position of queer color critique, from Marlon Riggs' Tongues Untied to Juana Maria Rodriguez's account of queer Latinidad, have disrupted the white European tradition's recasting of negativity as freeing, because shattering and impersonal. This perspective, Juana Maria is the example I put in your folder, insists on attachment to, on the desire to be known, on the sociality and affective thickness of gestures directed toward countering a world of erotophobia and discipline. This version of queer countersexuality tends to focus on recovery from and refusal of the negating disciplines of heterosupremacy. So from all of these perspectives, the sex is zoned for defanging ambivalence, the clarities of being harmed or welcome. At the same time, there's been a move away from sex to love and care in the Foucauldian tradition. Many of us were stirred and reshaped by this move in Foucault's Friendship as a Way of Life, which valorizes the desire in uneasiness of the homosexual mode of life, where friendship, fidelity, camaraderie, and companionship preside, in contrast to the image of gay ass-grabbing that obsesses, or in Foucault's terms, obsesses, the hetero-erotophobic imaginary. This tradition has produced brilliant gender and kinship creativity in the idiom of care. See the work of Lisa Dugan, Elizabeth Povinelli, Martin Manalanson, Eli Clare, and many others. At the same time, the move of care can preserve the sense that sex is less important than sexuality, and in fact a kind of interference with care, as though sex reduces people to trivial things, and that complexity is reduced to sex. People are often talking about that, right? Like, why are we reducing it to sex when it's so complicated? I'm like, reducing it? Sorry, now you know, I feel like I'm telling you what my inner voice is like. All right. Much affect theory, too, as in, for example, Sarah Ahmed's Promise of Happiness, has no interest in sex as a thing with a promise. Jose Muñoz's Cruising Utopia and Heather Love's Feeling Backward also lean strongly towards replacing sex with memory, hope, longing, and aesthetics. But, and this is where I invented the title of the book, there can be no adequate social theory without an account of the desire for the inconvenience of other people. I have suggested that social theory addresses the problem of social conflict, the inconvenience of the other. What it has neglected is how hard it is to sustain attachments that one wants or wants to want. It is not just that other people are inconvenient to our desires for proximity, engagement, attachment, and worlding, but that there are inconveniences we seek at different degrees of intensity and consciousness with various shapes of ambivalence. It is this convolution within attachment, along with pleasure and the ecstatic negativity of jouissance as such, to which sex points in this talk. And other people includes, but is not limited to, one's intimates, as we view them conventionally. This kind of concern with managing the inevitable disturbance of intimacy is also central to the democratic theory of dissensus from Arendt to Rancière, themselves antagonists, although not on this point, to the multitude theorists, neo-anarchists, and some feminists, notably Bonnie Honig. Yet discussions of the antagonism at the center of democracy and political theory too often cleave sex from the commons and other imaginaries of living with social division, if they admit sex to the imaginary of the social at all. Is sex a special case? That's what I'm really asking you. For historical reasons, I think so, but I don't really know, and so I hope we can have a conversation about it. Yet it's not surprising that even radicals need to draw boundaries that manage, displace entirely, or sublimate what's overwhelming in the disturbance of sex. How can one sustain a social theory through something defined by its formal disturbance? How can one not? The films in this talk, which you're not going to hear much about, are hardly exemplary in the sense of being ideal representations of sex in the event of happiness. But in their confrontation with the proximity of sexual non-sovereignty to social theory, their convolution of pedagogy, politics, and normative incapacities to sustain even the intimacy and democracy we want, and their reference to a revolutionary moment dedicated to changing the terms of the general happiness, they stage as acutely as anything does the problem of how to lose one's object world and the intimacy habits that go along with one's very attachment to it, while maintaining attachment to what social relations can do. They shift the negativity of the question of who the joke is on. And as they shift among tragic and comic registers of the encounter with erotophobia and desire, they test out which processes in proximity to sex might make it more possible to remain in proximity to a general happiness. I could stop here. I have 6 pages on the films. I could read them to you, or I could go to the last paragraph. How are you feeling? Are you exhausted? Should I just go to the last paragraph and then you can just keep going? Yeah. This is like a choose your own adventure, but it's not an adventure. I'm sorry. Oh, well. Okay, I'm keeping going. Hello. That's okay. It's on you. All of Todd Solondz's films are fairy tales, thought experiments, and an alter realism about the relation of sexuality and identity that collapse satire into tenderness about the ways people are stuck. And despite working from a queer tradition of framing sexuality through the lens of the grotesque and camp cartoonishness of anyone in desire, they maintain enthusiasm for those who continue to show up for life, given the austerity of their emotional resources. Solondz's oeuvre is distinguished by humorless comedy, by its tender and brittle disgust at pleasure, its intensity of sarcasm at the persistence of sincerity as a form of grace and aggression, and by its hyper-focus on the hovering presence of ridiculous sexual and affective optimism by people who wouldn't know how to sustain it substantively, even if they were able to achieve it. It's an oeuvre about appetites for desire in a post-political world, where all infrastructures are private, the police are always too late, the community always clueless, obsessed with the reproduction of their own normative gestures, rather than with resonating affects or with feeling out life together. Perverse distance. Okay, I don't understand the sentence. Okay, I'm just going to read it too, but it doesn't make any sense. Perverse distance and perverse distance are I wonder what I meant, are the machines of pleasure's pleasurelessness here. In Happiness reigns a family of 2 parents, Mona and Lenny Jordan. They seem Jewish, but their kids, not so much. They have, and I don't know what to do with that either. But that was a very Jewish thing for me to say, by the way. They have 3 daughters, Helen, a trauma poet, Joy, a pallid and whiny folk guitarist, and Trish, the housewife who, in her own words, has it all. Don't blame me if I have it all. They are all ruled and satisfied by habits, norms, and cliches. The second generational figures are drained effigies from the feminist imaginary, choice feminism, making claims on self-fulfillment and making better worlds, but remaining attached to encountering the world as long as there is no risk. Which means, of course, that loss is all around. They are also humorless, and the joke of desire is squarely on them. In this fairy tale, Trish is married to a pedophile who rapes young boys. That's the middle one on the top. He's also the psychoanalyst of an obscene phone caller from another plot, Philip Seymour Hoffman in the middle. And during Philip Seymour Hoffman's boring recitations of his fantasized violence to the women he desires, the psychoanalyst has a fantasy of taking an assault weapon into a park and shooting down the mass enjoyers. Joy, an ESL substitute strikebreaker in the upper corner, is attracted to men who brutalize her and writes romantic love songs about longing, including the film's title song, Happiness. Helen, the poet, has rape fantasies. That's Helen on the upper right-hand side. If only I'd been raped as a child, I'd know authenticity, she says, before seeking an assignation with her obscene phone caller who excites her on the phone but repels her in person. Later, she sets up a blind date between this predator and her sister Joy. Where there's life, there's hope, Joy says meaningfully, and all the women in the family clink glasses to it. Because at this point in history and life, all that remains are cliches to keep them bound to optimism. They have no movement culture to have an alternative reality to test, right? A cliche is a performance of optimism about truth, both that there is truth and that it will not be too disturbing. The film culminates this attachment in the empty formalism of a double happiness. First, all the women of the broken family gather and affirm the hope written into being on the lookout for more coupling. Meanwhile, Billy, I don't think you see him here, Billy, the 12-year-old namesake of the serial rapist, is masturbating. Oh, let's see, sorry. All right, okay. Let's see. Is masturbating, where's masturbating? Yes, is masturbating on the balcony of their condo as a huge-breasted woman puts suntan oil on all over her bikini body. Billy has spent the film transitioning to adolescence, worrying about his penis size and whether he will ever come. His psychiatrist father, who's the sexual predator, was warm and unshaming with him and acts appropriately and honestly to his son until their final scene when the son says, "Would you ever have raped me?" And the father says, "No, I probably would have just masturbated." But Billy only ejaculates when she turns over and he sees her ass. He has the same sexual preference as his father. Ironically, or something, the child comes on the balcony rail, and then the child's dog comes up and licks the cum heartily. And then, even more outrageously and hilariously, the dog goes to the child's mother and licks her on the kisser. Yeah. And everyone in the audience goes, "Oh," like this. Happy Billy comes to the brunch table of his assembled family to announce his sexual achievement. The film ends with the camera looking at him. We don't get a reaction shot. The audience is left holding the news. This is Salon's version of light comedy. The persistence of the appetites and violence and foolishness, the hunger for sex, the desire never to be too disturbed by another live person, clueless about how we find our better objects and what we can do with sex. Omnivorous eating, murdering, raping, coming, and aesthetic puns, these actions are barriers to learning about desire, and especially barriers to unlearning it. There is no world for unlearning it once the political is cleaved from the sexual. Salon's world is an effect of the sexual revolution, completely emptied of critical ideas about sex, family, or world. Okay, that was the first example. Second example. Yeah. What comes next? Okay. In the final scene of the film Half Nelson, a white man of around 30 years old sits on one side of a beige couch in a spare, worn apartment. At the other end is a young black girl of 13, about 13. The camera is pulled back to middle distance. There's an intimacy in their distance, alienation too. The man used to be her Marxist history teacher, David Dunn, played by Ryan Gosling, who was done with that because of an unprosecuted sexual assault he committed on another teacher while under the influence of crack. Throughout the film, the teacher and the student are living on the precipice of an urban drug economy. Early in the film, Dre, the young girl, Sharika Epps, finds Dunn in a crack collapse on the bathroom floor of the school gym where he had just coached her basketball team. Later, he tries to keep her from becoming a courier from the same man from whom he buys his crack. Both characters are always too late to rescue or be rescued. Both characters are wedged in a riven social space. But if prevention is out of the question, so is additionally repair. In this film, there is no such thing as a trauma to be overcome. There are life situations and episodes you get through. And so what remains for them is to help each other lighten the load of consequences and to interrupt the next phase of exposure to the life, whose pressures are structural as well as personal life forms. Whatever it is between them isn't love. It's the gift and luck of getting each other's affective complexities and bearing them protectively. The appetite here, the pleasure, is in mutually bearing the unbearable, while they search for ways to move with it. Their differences in age, race, and cultural capital are manifest but unstated between them. But as for gender, there's a suspicion circulated throughout the film that the attachment is erotic, and it is from Dre's end, but it's the man who bears the cloud of suspicion. Dre is trying to figure out how to be expressive without losing her defenses. She wants to be a kid, maybe even a transgender kid because she dresses in boys' clothes, with a bike and lollipops that do not signify drug dealing and dry crack mouth. She wants to activate sexual difference too. She plays with makeup in front of a mirror, but not the kind that produces stress and abjection. But their mutual thematics comes from politics. As a Marxist history teacher trying to teach his kids about dialectics, Dunn teaches of U.S. civil rights history as the struggle between opposing structural forces. He is also writing and drawing a children's book dramatizing the events of the 60s and 70s, but he's stuck on it. He's got a writing block or a drawing block. It's as though if he can tell the external political story, he will be able to fix something internal as well. It's addiction versus the intention to self-overcome. It's representation versus the freedom of fabulation. The film is more confident about the effects that knowing the course of history was once changed by radicals than it is about how brokenness can be reactivated into an ambivalence you can live with. It also communicates that one cannot ask one genre of question without the other, which is to say that Half Nelson is saturated by the sentimental history of the race melodrama. Here, predictably, the writers give the white guy a last name, while the black foil just has a first. So it's not a matter of equality here, again, but reciprocity. Reciprocity is so interesting. You know, what is it that produces a dynamic in which people are holding up the world without being equal? What does that mean? And central to the question of erotophobia and the ordinary of disturbance and violence. Headlocked by their good and bad angels, as the wrestling title suggests, they share a structure of disturbed conscience and blocked redemption. At the same time, this is not a melodrama either in its moral shape or acting style. Both characters are defined by a recessive mood. There is no easy way to distinguish their openness from their closedness, their self-possession and dispossession, their toughness and their tenderness. But even given that likeness, their attunement is intermittent, seesawing, without the movement context that could have amplified their gestures into infrastructures. Central to the solidarity without politics that they have is the joke. At a certain point in the middle of the film, the two trade uncomfortable questions about their personal lives that neither can answer without being inappropriate. So there's silence and the specter of relational defeat. But the impersonal works, sometimes, because it gives some breathing space. Dunn teaches Dre about the free speech movement and historical turning points. And she teaches him that women are seduced by jokes. Dre, what you need is some jokes. Women love jokes. What do you call cheese that's not yours? Nacho cheese. It's yours if you need it. The bad joke gift idea leads Dunn to a good seduction, but the teacher's too addicted to stay cleaned up and therefore reliable to intimacy. As the film closes, he is completely bottomed out, and she pulls him out of a hotel room to which she's delivered drugs. The atmosphere gets tense and awkward. It leads to the final scene on the couch that is not a therapy couch. He breaks the ice by telling a joke. Dunn. Knock, knock. Dre. Who's there? Dunn. The interrupting cow. Dunn. Oh, no, Dre. The interrupting cow who? Done. Moo. Dre. Laughing. That was horrible. Done. Yeah. End of film. The scene is shot intimately, with the camera pulling in towards the cocked heads, relaxing in their old banter, the comedy of remarriage. The joke substitutes for whatever real they could say, but it's a real exchange in its own way because they're reaching back into history and pulling out an alternative trajectory. She's getting what she needs, which is to feel chosen by her expertise in the joke, and he's demonstrating what he's only half believed, that the teacher is sometimes teachable. The joke is also that he messes up the joke. In that knock-knock joke, the interrupting cow is supposed to say moo while she's saying the interrupting cow who, but he neglects to interrupt. They have a good laugh because a knock-knock joke is a parody of consent. The person who answers the door always consents, even if they know better. They're interpolated into showing up for the encounter. Like someone says, I have a knock-knock joke for you, and then you have to say knock-knock. Or then you don't, but that would be, and that would be the failed joke experiment. The unsayable magic of affective infrastructure between them makes it okay. The low bar demand to show up for the joke makes it okay. So if history is the study of change over time, one might say that comedy is the study of change through the pleasure of bearing the non-sovereignty of timing and relation. Self and world interruption are the beginning and the end of what they can work on. No joke. These films demonstrate some of the contemporary complexity of putting sex comedy and sex violence in the same scenario that takes on the destruction of capital and citizenship. The co-presence of comedy and violence is revelatory about why it's hard to sustain fidelity to the very transformations that might find form, systematicity, and structuration. The problem is at once scalar and subjective, but it is also about the devastating effects of a cleavage between the perspective of the political and the perspective of the sexual. Each operates logics for managing ambivalence about the forms of life and fantasy available at their historical condisjuncture. Each has its way of making messes and cleaning them up without dispensing the problem of having and not having the forms of life and intimacy you want, but not entirely. This talk sits in the mess their impasse makes. For it is only from here, in the zone of multiple wrecked defenses, that Foucault's new relational modes can be made. If only new relational modes could be freely and unambivalently chosen, let alone imagined. But the incorporation of new forms requires the disorganization and unlearning of others. There is no choice but to use the structural productivity of ambivalence to make more bearable forms of life. The case of sex in proximity to happiness demands an archival discipline around scenes such as these, and more, upsetting the politically rigid ones that see the tragic as truth and the comic that is also there as ephemeral, ridiculous, subconceptual, mere pleasure, and just luck. For as revolutionary desire takes up the body, so its theory must take up what's inconvenient about what we want for it and for the world. Thank you. So yeah, questions. I love questions, and I put a lot of pressure on you to think of some.
I'll try to keep track of who raises their hand.
Okay.
So we have the microphone circulating. Wonderful. Okay, so folks raise their hands, please. Why don't we start up here?
I'm putting this back up in case you need my email address.
So thanks, that was great. I really mean it.
Where are you?
I'm right
hi.
here. Hi.
Hi.
I just want to ask a few clarifying questions.
Sure.
The first one is, does happiness always have to be an affect, or can it be something else, like eudaimonia, right? Like a kind of state of living. Because the promise of happiness in Ahmed's piece is also about the, not wanting to be fooled by this.
Oh, what did you say that made it go away? Not wanting to be fooled, eh?
Is it back on?
Yeah.
Okay. Not wanting to be fooled by the kind of, this sort of promise that is always a betrayal or something like that.
Right.
But can happiness be something other than a deal and more intransitive? Does it have to take an object? Which gets me to a second clarifying question, and that is, do we have to be attached, right? I mean, you're really interested in attachments, and can you have another kind of erotic life without attachments?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And if that's so, then is, some of your question is about relationality, but maybe, and this gets to the biggest question I have at the end, and you said, is sex a special case, right? And you said you think it is, and isn't
Don't know
part,
if it is.
you don't know if it is yet, but isn't part of what Foucault, I think, is saying that the problem is that sex has become a special case, insofar as that we can't just sort of have fun doing it or whatever. It becomes loaded with so much semiotic freight that it fucks us up, basically. So those are some clarifying questions.
Oh, you think? Let's see. Thank you so much for that. You guys are amazing. I just other people's minds are amazing. I meant to say that after your intro too. That I don't know. That's why it's like fun to take things on the road, you know. All right. So the first question was, and by the way, Riley did this without writing the questions down, which I just thought was amazing too. So anyway, I'm not doing that. So does happiness have to be an affect, or could it be a state of living? Yeah, it could be a state of living. I wasn't saying, in fact, I don't even know if I have a concept of happiness in this thing, except that the films are trying to say that you try to build things with other humans so that you can achieve a thing you conceptualize as happiness. It might be an episode. The episode might be exemplary, or it might be a state of things in which, I just think about this book I just taught called Bitter Fruit by Alchemath Dangor, where there's a moment at which somebody chooses to have alienated sex with her husband, and then she says, he made life worth living. Like just the fact that she could have the things she predicted, and that she would be disturbed in the way she was used to, and that she got to have her comfortable nest of irony. That counts as happiness. It wouldn't necessarily be happiness on a scale, on one of those hospital scales of pain or whatever, So I don't mean happiness. I mean, the thing about affect is you could say something, there's a structure of happiness, and then there would be the experience of it. The structure of happiness might be you get the thing you want. At a slightly higher intensity than satisfaction, where you have some sense of this is what I want, this life, this thing, this relation, this taste, this whatever. So it could be an episode where you're like, oh yeah. And then also, in Freud's definition of pleasure isn't what feels good, it's the state you want to maintain, the state you would like to re-experience. So it's also that something like the capacity to re-experience the thing that would constitute pleasure, or to build an infrastructure of life where you would want to enter it again. I think I called in the paper the thing you would want to wake up to, but also the thing you would want to move with, and you would want to bring people into it, so you would have people to test it with. Testing is really, that Juliet Mitchell essay called Theory as Object? It's a really good essay, you should read it. It's a lot about how do you use life? How do you, not use in the bad instrumental way of, instrumentalize, but how do you use it to make things different rather than to produce a kind of, but different doesn't mean everything has to be anti-normative and radically, it might be that you just, all right. So I think this is an affirmative answer to the question of can it be a state of things? And the state of things of happiness, the structure of it might include all kinds of affect that you wouldn't recognize as happiness. Because like you could be disappointed in someone the way you're used to. And that would count as happiness because it would be confirming of your sense of how your world works. Okay? So that's a conversation about affect and its relation to experience and structure. Well, I'm happy to talk more about that. All right, second thing is, do we have to be attached? Well, I kind of joked and said no, but there was this moment at the turn of the 20th century when bourgeois parents were advised not to touch their children because they would give them germs and then they would die. And then, of course, what happened is all these babies died out of failure to thrive. Okay. So I'm pretty convinced by that. So, so I think there is a thing. Really, I think so part of the argument of this book, I said the book has many moving parts. One of the arguments is that we don't start as individuals. We start in relation. So if we're starting in relation, we're starting in non-sovereign. Sovereignty is a back formation from non-sovereignty. Okay, you're starting as non-sovereign, and insofar as you're starting as non-sovereign, you have to be attached to being in a relation. You don't have to be attached to being with a person. You don't have to be attached to but you might be, the object that you're attached to might be being in relation. Okay, we have very atrophied model of what the object is. An object isn't just a person. It could be the situation, to go back to the happiness answer. It could be the situation you want to be in. All right. So in the non-sovereign relationality through which I move through the world, the fact that there are scenes I feel welcome in and want to welcome other people into would constitute an attachment to a scene, a kind of movement, a genre of life. I'm not sure why that is the figure for it. Because it's the L in sign language. As a genre of life. So when gay men say that they can have sex without attachment or impersonal sex, they don't mean they're not attached to something. They're just attached to the scene. And also to the capacity to have an experience without having to build a life on it. Except they're building a life on it, but it's not a life between individuals. It's a life of a community. Okay, so those are the kinds of, that's where I would go as the kind of the universe or penumbra of, am I answering too long?
No.
Okay, sorry.
Just trying to keep track.
I'm really happy to say yes or no.
Time as you-
I'll say yes or no, I don't care. Okay, all right, is sex a special case? What did you say about that? You think it is, Foucault, right. That's right, Foucault was upset because, I don't mean the psychologist, but he was. He was upset because he felt like gay men were just being produced as kind of cookie-cutter Marlboro men, macho dudes. And he loved loving. I mean, he says my favorite time of the day is putting the lover in a taxi, which made me love Foucault. But not because I love that, because I just love that he would say it. And that there is something free about being able to breathe your air in the space of a non-sovereignty that was intense or something. So he didn't want gay men to be reduced to sex. So he said care, life, world-making. He has a beautiful end sentence, the closing sentence to The Friendship is a Way of Life, about putting sex in front of a blank screen and trying to figure out what it could become. I love that. So he said that. I think, but we're talking about a different time now. It's not just the reduction to sex. It's like gay men are like this or women are like that. It's the feeling that trauma is the real, the feeling that pain is the real, the feeling that all of the forms of life to which you are attached are, positively attached, are when you dodge the bullet of the real. Okay. I think we're in a phase now where we kind of think that about sex. We're not thinking about the sex we're having or whatever, but when we're talking about the pervasiveness of sexual violence now, and the question of how is it possible to have a non-reproductive relation to that? It looks like if you haven't had an event that marks you as a member of the community of the injured, or the potential community of the injured, like you might not have had a bad event in your life, which I'm so happy for you, but if you might not have had a bad event, but you understand that you're one toothpick away from having it. You live next to the doghouse rather than in the doghouse, but you understand the doghouse is right there. I could tell you so many stories from my last quarter of teaching trauma about this. So what I'm trying to argue against, erotophobia as an anthemic, organizing, affect world for thinking about the transformation of sexual violence culture. I definitely want culture change, but I don't want it that way. I don't know. So those are some ways I would go to that question. I also think, by the way, I said this in the Cruel Optimism, which I thought was very cheeky, sort of, which was, I think Foucault was wrong about sex is the truth of the modern subject. I think it's emotions that have been deemed the truth of the modern subject. Like, this is what I feel. And sex is one of the places where people think they're expressing their emotions. I don't know that everyone in this room would vote for that, but anymore. But anyway, so there's that problem too. But that's where I would go to answer your question.
Trust the historian to be chrononormative, but we are a little bit short on time, so please keep our questions. No, our questions.
Wait, how is that
short
possible?
and
Because you
singular.
made me go longer. That's right.
Yeah.
I was going to start with singular, even though I have two, but I'm dropping the routinized question. So you're emphasizing a lot And thank you, and the usual yada, yada, yada. Although I was for cutting to the end, but
Oh,
I
I'm
didn't
sorry.
say so.
Okay, I wish you had.
No, it's okay. So your talk is emphasizing the new and the experimental a great deal, and set against an anti-reproductive analytic. But I don't
Set
understand.
against? No, that is the anti-reproductive analytic.
I'm sorry, set against the reproductive analytic.
Okay.
Sorry, that it's an anti-reproductive. I don't get this because aside from digital reproduction, all other reproduction introduces all kinds of new and or is a form, and experiment can be considered a form of reproduction. So I feel like that's meaning that reproduction inherently reproduces what it intends to what is intended by the reproduction, that it's inheritively normative, and so I'm pushing on the anti-reproductive out of us.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
I have to think about it, but sort of here's the first response. I'll be really short. I don't know, like I'm submitting to you now. So I guess a few things. One is normativity is an incredibly absorbent thing. It can absorb a lot of variation and still be reproduced. Okay, that's one of the things that's amazing about it. So when I say, so first of all, when I say experimental, I mean it in the kind of 19th century sense. People are trying things out. I don't mean doing an experiment. I mean it in the old-fashioned sense. So it's a little slightly different than I think you heard, but I don't blame you for hearing it that way since I was using an archaic formation. But it's true that I guess I'm thinking a lot about the forms of life that become calcified as anchors for life. So that's what erotophobia is in this talk, is an anchor that people feel like it would solve the problem. It would solve a set of problems, like all the stuff I put in your folders. It would solve a set of problems about living and relationality and living intimately. And so it's against that. It's against the desire for calcified forms of normativity that I'm really saying anti-reproductive. I agree that there's tons of creativity in reproduction itself. But the question of what we pay attention to and what gets referred to as collectively held is where I think a lot about norms. Now, one more thing. You and I both work on infrastructure. And the thing about infrastructure is that if you don't use it, it doesn't exist. And if you use it, it's a living form that's moving. So that's why I like the concept of infrastructure as a way of thinking about relationality, because you do have things you're returning to, but the condition under which you're returning to is that they're productive. Not necessarily being reproductive, but they're reproductive enough that you can return to them. But they're productive because you have to keep things moving in, as it were, the supply chain of intimacy or the supply chain of life.
Okay, we have time for one more
Oh,
question.
come on.
Let's go to the back, and then we can continue the conversation in the lovely, delicious food.
Well, there are two hands up, so maybe we can have both of them, and then I promise to only answer one.
If they're right next to each other, let's stack them.
Yeah,
Bargaining.
thanks.
Resistance.
I'm bad.
Disruption.
I'm driving.
Hi, it's on. It's on. Hi. Thanks. There was plenty to think with there. So I'm really fixated on a moment where you talked about the version of this talk or one of its interventions or one of its iterations that was not so good, and then you took to the couch.
And you're like, that was the not so good, because this. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, and that there are also, 3 versions of an introduction, that there's like a lot of like process here. And I was wondering if you could talk about what the process or maybe the social process of all of these iterative of this like iterative situation have been, and how maybe it seems like, to me it seems like you must have experienced some degree of the drive for inconvenience as a part of this process, particularly with Munoz and maybe with queer of color critique. It seems like as sort of holistically maybe like where the drive for inconvenience has moved as you've tried to make this talk better, ethically or just generally formally better. So I wondered if you could talk about what this process of this iterative process has been for you.
Thank you. And then see, there was somebody over there. Okay, just talk loud. Yeah. Could you say why you think that?
Please take the microphone over here and actually just really quickly repeat what you said, because otherwise people at home can't hear it, and also there may be people.
Gotcha. Okay, sure.
They're live streaming you.
Oh, okay, cool. I was hoping you could say more about the affective function of the finality of erotophobia and how you see that as intersecting with our current unbearable gendered and political structures. I'm thinking specifically of Me Too. And because I feel like erotophobia looks very different for feminists than it does for incels and brain cells, like you very briefly mentioned in your talk.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. I don't know if I can do this. I feel like so to the first person question, I feel like I described during the talk a lot of the stuff that you were asking about, which is, I take this on the road and people are like, no. You can't just produce, you can't say that, you can't say that the mutual penetration of, the mutual disturbance of subjects, that under regimes of sexual difference, there is no equality of subjects such that they're having the same experiences in an expression of equality. And I was a little bit going with the plot. And I had to learn from my audiences. That's why I take stuff on the road, is because because you're just you. And the reason that you circulate your work with other people is because they're not you. And so, I like other people. I like other people's minds. And so the fact that there was a repetition of a resistance, I thought was a really important, like I had to sit back and think, what do I think? It was clear that what I thought wasn't, I maybe should be a better writer, but I also maybe should have different ideas. So I had to figure that out. And I think, and it's really hard to unlearn your instincts for things. It's really hard to unlearn your gut, especially when you fought so hard to have a gut. Do you know? I don't mean, you know what I mean. You fought so hard to follow the line of thought that you had been developing, and then actually not having confidence about the line of thought that your gut took you to was also a part of becoming a better thinker. Anyway, all that was hard, but anyway, that was one thing. And then also, I had been working with the unlearning in all these other areas that didn't feel personal to me. Like I know that like unlearning normativity means that you have to become disorganized in a new way. And this was a place where I had to like take it personally. That's sort of the kind of thing I would say to you. And I'm not sure I'm really getting your question, but that's just briefly one thing I would say, and then, like, let's talk later, et cetera. And it's true that the erotophobia, I don't want to say, it's true. So Kathy Weeks said to me last night, and so I do a lot of revising on my paper, because she says so clearly, there's a lot of pleasure in being able to say no. Don Kulik has a really good essay about this, actually. There's a lot of pleasure in being able to say no to the pleasure regimes of sexual normativity. And that links the incels and the brain cells to Me Too. They're all saying no. That's interesting. I don't want to, what? They're not saying no to the same thing, but they kind of are saying no to the pleasure economy that isn't interpolating me the way I want. I'm saying no to that. And then they both produce a politics, and they both produce a public sphere. So, if we had longer, there would be a lot of similarity to the kind of the production of a movement culture around saying no. What follows from no? I want to know. And so I'm kind of saying, well, I don't want to say yes. I don't want to just go to the yes route, but I want to say, the thing that you're trying to resolve is mixed feelings. It's the sense that you deserve something, but you also wanted something from other people. What is it that you wanted? Now, there's lots of things to say about the incels and the brain cells. I mean, the brain cells totally crack me up, because they think they're smarter than the incels because they can think about their misogyny. Anyway, I have to stop now. But I'm available. I would like to talk to you. You know where to reach me. Thank you very much for your patience.
Please join us next door for a reception, and please bring your questions both for Lauren and for Riley and for everyone else, and we'll continue the conversation there.